The rain hammered against the window pane, a relentless rhythm mirroring the frantic beat of his heart. Mike stared out at the city lights blurring through the downpour, a stark contrast to the hazy, sun-drenched memories that flooded his mind. 18 years. 18 years since he'd last seen her. 18 years since he'd made the decision that had shaped his life. A decision that now, with the jarring reality of Sarah's existence, felt like a brutal punch to the gut. He remembered the way the sunlight caught the gold in her hair, the way her laughter could fill a room, the way her eyes, even in anger, held a captivating intensity. He'd been young, foolish, consumed by his own ambitions, blinded by the intoxicating allure of his own future. He'd been a college student, full of dreams and aspirations, certain that his path was destined for greatness. The thought of fatherhood, of responsibility, had seemed like an insurmountable obstacle, a detour on the highway to his success. He'd been selfish, utterly and completely self-absorbed. He saw her face again, younger, softer, her eyes brimming with a mixture of hope and apprehension. They were sitting on a park bench, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass. He remembered the way her hand rested lightly on her stomach, a subtle but undeniable sign of the life growing within her. The words, "I'm pregnant, Mike," hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. He'd stammered a response, a mumbled excuse about the timing being wrong, about his future plans, about the impracticality of it all. His words had been carefully chosen, laced with a veneer of concern, yet ultimately revealing his self-preservation. He hadn't meant to hurt her, not intentionally. He'd simply been terrified, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the responsibility that was thrust upon him. He'd envisioned a life where he wouldn't be burdened by such a heavy weight, a life where his ambitions wouldn't be stifled. He'd painted a picture of a future where he could provide for a family, but only after he had achieved a certain level of success. He had selfishly and irresponsibly placed his own dreams above the life growing within her. The memory twisted in his gut, a nauseating knot of regret and self-recrimination. He'd offered her money, a pathetic attempt at compensation, a feeble gesture to absolve himself of his responsibility. He'd offered her a clean break, a chance to start over without the burden of him. He saw the hurt in her eyes, the betrayal etched on her face, a silent accusation that echoed through the years. He'd turned away, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and guilt, the weight of his decision settling heavily on his shoulders. He hadn't contacted her since. He hadn't seen her. He'd rationalized his actions, telling himself he was protecting her, shielding her from the potential turmoil of his chaotic life, ensuring she had the opportunity to create a life for herself free from his involvement. He had convinced himself that he was doing what was best. Years had passed. He'd met his wife Lisa, a woman who embodied everything he'd ever wanted: stability, kindness, unwavering support. They had built a life together, a comfortable suburban existence filled with love and laughter. He'd never spoken a word about his past to Lisa, burying the secret deep within his heart. He'd built a life, a family, a reality he clung to fiercely. Now, that carefully constructed reality was crumbling around him, the foundation shaken by the unexpected arrival of Sarah. The DNA test, that simple, seemingly innocuous act, had unleashed a tidal wave of guilt, uncertainty, and fear. He felt the weight of his past decisions pressing down on him, suffocating him. The image of Sarah's face flickered in his mind, a mirror reflecting a part of himself he'd long forgotten, a part he'd buried beneath layers of denial and self-deception. He saw her eyes, those same intelligent, thoughtful eyes that seemed to hold a quiet strength, a resilience that he recognized. He wondered what she thought of him, what kind of man she'd perceived him to be. Was he the man she had imagined, the man her mother had painted in vague, almost mythical terms? Or was he something else entirely, a complete stranger? He'd lived his life without her, and she had lived hers without him. Now they were forced to confront the chasm that had separated them, a chasm created by his past actions. He'd avoided looking at her photograph closely before he hadn't been ready to truly confront his decision. The grainy image he found online had only been a glimpse a shadow of a person who was a tangible piece of his past. Looking at the image now, he saw his own features reflected in her face, a haunting reminder of the life he'd so easily discarded. A life he had denied himself, and a life he'd denied her. He'd spent years carefully crafting his identity, building a life free from the burden of that past. But now the past, in the form of an 18-year-old daughter, had returned, demanding acknowledgement, demanding reconciliation. The rain continued its relentless assault on the window, a mournful symphony accompanying his inner turmoil. He took a deep breath, the air heavy with the weight of his past, the weight of his present reality. The meeting tomorrow felt like a reckoning, a confrontation with the choices he'd made, a chance to finally confront the ghost he'd carried for so long. But could he face it? Could he face Sarah? Could he face Lisa? The thought of telling Lisa sent another wave of nausea through him. He'd built his life on a foundation of lies, a lie of omission that had become a cornerstone of his marriage. How could he shatter that foundation? How could he explain the absence, the silence, the 18 years of deceit? His mind raced, trying to find a way to navigate this treacherous path. There was no easy answer, no simple solution. He knew that. He closed his eyes, the memories continuing to wash over him, a relentless tide pulling him under. He saw the young woman he'd loved, the child he'd abandoned. He saw his wife, the woman who had given him a life he'd never believed he deserved. And he saw Sarah, a stranger who was also a daughter, a piece of his past that he could no longer ignore, a piece of his future that he could not avoid. The weight of his choices, the weight of his silence, pressed down on him, heavy and inescapable. He had a choice to make. He needed to make it. Tomorrow he would face the consequences of his actions. Tomorrow he would confront the past. The next morning dawned grey and overcast, mirroring the turmoil churning within Mike. He barely slept, the image of Sarah's face a blend of his own features and a stranger's enigmatic gaze haunting his dreams. He'd considered countless scenarios, rehearsed countless conversations, each ending in a different kind of disaster. Telling Lisa felt like a death sentence for their marriage, a betrayal so profound it might be irreparable. But the thought of not telling her, of continuing to live a lie, felt even worse, a slow, agonizing erosion of his soul. He drove to his brother Mark's house with a leaden heart. Mark lived in a modern, minimalist home, a stark contrast to Mike's comfortable suburban dwelling. The sleek lines and muted colours reflected Mark's personality, reserved, analytical, and emotionally detached. Their relationship had always been complex, a blend of sibling rivalry and grudging affection, punctuated by years of silence and sporadic reconciliation. Mike knew that Mark wouldn't offer comforting platitudes, he'd offer brutal honesty, wrapped in a layer of cold, calculated logic. And that, Mike realized, was exactly what he needed. Mark opened the door, his expression impassive. He was taller than Mike, with sharper features and a perpetually cynical smirk playing on his lips. He looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine, impeccably dressed, his hair perfectly styled. The image was almost jarring against the backdrop with Mike's internal chaos. He gestured for Mike to enter, his movements precise and economical. "So," Mark said, gesturing to the minimalist living room, its only decoration a stark, abstract painting. "The prodigal son returns. What's the emergency this time?" Mike sank into a sleek, modern armchair, the leather cool beneath his skin. He didn't beat around the bush. He told Mark everything: the DNA test, Sarah's existence, his 18-year silence, the gnawing guilt that had consumed him. He spoke in a rush, his voice tight with emotion, the words tumbling out in a torrent of confession. Mark listened, his expression remaining unchanged. He didn't interrupt, but his silence felt heavy, charged with a silent judgment. When Mike finished, a heavy silence descended, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning. "So," Mark finally said, his voice devoid of warmth, "you've got a love child you conveniently forgot about for nearly 2 decades. Mike winced. "It wasn't convenient, Mark. I was young. Scared?" Mark interrupted, a hint of amusement in his tone. Or selfish? The accusation stung. Both, Mike admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But I'm trying to make amends. I want to be a part of Sarah's life. Mark leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. And what about Lisa, your perfect wife, the cornerstone of your carefully constructed life? How do you plan on shattering that foundation? The question was a direct hit, exposing the raw nerve at the core of Mike's dilemma. He had spent years building a life with Lisa, a life that felt both fragile and irreplaceable. The thought of losing it, of losing her, was unbearable. I don't know, Mike confessed, his voice cracking. I'm terrified of losing her, of ruining everything we have. Mark remained silent for a moment, his gaze steady and assessing. Then he spoke, his voice surprisingly soft. Look, Mike, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. You messed up, royally. This isn't about convenient solutions or easy answers. This is about facing the consequences of your actions. About being honest, not just with Lisa, but with yourself, and with Sarah. I know, Mike said, his voice choked with emotion. But I don't know how to do it. How do I tell Lisa? How do I explain 18 years of silence? Honesty, Mark said simply. Brutal, unflinching honesty. Tell her everything. Don't try to justify it. Don't try to minimize it. Just tell her the truth. And prepare for the fallout. It won't be easy. It might even destroy your marriage. But it's the only path to any kind of redemption. Mark's advice, though harsh, felt strangely liberating. It removed the burden of searching for a magical solution, replacing it with the stark reality of the situation. He had to tell Lisa. He had to face the consequences of his actions, however devastating they might be. Their conversation shifted to practicalities. Mark, ever the pragmatist, began dissecting the situation with clinical precision. He questioned Mike about Sarah's life, her relationship with her mother, her expectations, her potential reactions to meeting her father. He helped Mike formulate a strategy, a plan of action. He even offered to help mediate, to be a buffer between Mike and Lisa during the inevitable confrontation. Mark's involvement wasn't just about offering practical advice. It was about bridging the chasm that had always existed between them. Their relationship, always strained, had been largely built on unspoken resentments and half-truths. This crisis, Mike realized, was forcing them to confront their own shared history, to acknowledge the unspoken bond of brotherhood that ran deeper than their differences. Mark's perspective was invaluable. He offered a detached, objective viewpoint, free from the emotional entanglement that Mike was experiencing. He reminded Mike of the importance of understanding Sarah's perspective, of acknowledging her right to know her father, regardless of the circumstances of her birth. As the conversation progressed, Mike began to see the situation in a new light. He had not only hurt his girlfriend, but he'd hurt his brother too, by creating a rift that had existed for far too long. The day ended with a sense of grim determination. Mike had a daunting task ahead of him, a path paved with uncertainty and potential heartbreak. But he was no longer alone. He had Mark's support, his unwavering, albeit cynical support, and that in itself felt like a small victory. The weight of his past remained, but it no longer felt quite so crushing. He still had to face Lisa, to face the consequences of his actions, but the presence of his brother beside him, a silent, yet supportive ally, gave him the courage to walk toward that daunting confrontation. The rain outside had stopped, and a fragile ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, a tentative glimmer of hope in the midst of the storm. The chipped paint on the windowsill mirrored the cracks in Clara's life. Sunlight, weak and hesitant, filtered through the grimy glass, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air of her small apartment. It was a space both cramped and overflowing, a testament to years of quiet struggle and carefully guarded secrets. The scent of lavender, a feeble attempt at masking the underlying aroma of stale coffee and old anxieties, hung heavy in the air. Clara sat at her worn kitchen table, a chipped mug of lukewarm tea warming her hands, a stark contrast to the icy chill that had settled in her heart 18 years ago. 18 years. 18 years of silence, of carefully constructed lies, of a life lived in the shadows. 18 years since she'd looked into Mike's eyes, his youthful recklessness battling with a nascent fear, and made the decision that would shape the rest of her life. She hadn't chosen this path lightly. The memory of that conversation, the weight of his uncertainty, the raw, desperate plea in his eyes, it still haunted her. A constant ache in the quiet spaces between her breaths. He'd been a whirlwind, Mike. Full of passion and promises, a tempest of youthful energy that swept her off her feet. Their love story had been brief, intense, a firework display burning brightly before sputtering and dying. The discovery of her pregnancy hadn't been a joyous occasion, but a moment of stark terror. She'd been a student, living hand-to-mouth, with no family support and a future that seemed to dissolve into a hazy, uncertain mist. Telling Mike had felt impossible. She'd envisioned his reaction, the potential for rejection, the overwhelming fear that he might disappear, leaving her alone to navigate the daunting journey ahead. She pictured the upheaval, the changes it would bring to his life, the potential disruption to his future. He was ambitious, driven, on the cusp of something big. The thought of burdening him with a child, a responsibility he might not be ready for, had paralyzed her. So she'd kept the secret, a heavy burden she carried alone. She'd faced the judgmental whispers, the sidelong glances, the unspoken questions. The isolation was profound, a solitude that gnawed at her soul. She'd raised Sarah alone, working multiple jobs, sacrificing her dreams, her aspirations, everything, to give her daughter a life she hadn't had. It wasn't an easy choice, it was a desperate act of protection, born out of fear and a love so immense it was almost unbearable. Raising Sarah hadn't been easy. The financial struggles were constant, the emotional toll immense. There were nights when the loneliness felt crushing, when the weight of her decision threatened to suffocate her. Yet, in Sarah's bright, curious eyes, she found a strength she didn't know she possessed. Sarah was her anchor, her reason, her unwavering source of hope and purpose. She'd tried to shield Sarah from the knowledge of her father's absence, painting a picture of a distant, unavailable relative. She'd woven a narrative of complicated circumstances, vague explanations, and carefully crafted lies. She'd protected her child from the pain of rejection, from the potential of shattered expectations, from the bitter taste of abandonment. The DNA test had been a last-ditch effort, a desperate attempt to uncover some truth that she'd kept hidden for so long. The revelation of Mike's brother's involvement had come as a shock, a twist of fate she hadn't foreseen. It had shaken her to the core. It had exposed the fragility of her meticulously constructed lies, the carefully built walls of her carefully guarded secret. She'd always known that the truth would eventually emerge, but the timing, the manner of its arrival, was something she hadn't anticipated. Now, the consequences of her decision were unfolding. Sarah was reaching out, seeking answers, demanding the truth. And Clara, facing the fallout of her actions, felt a crushing weight of guilt and regret. The protection she'd sought to provide had ultimately created a new kind of pain, a different kind of hurt. She picked up a framed photograph from the table, Sarah as a child, a bright-eyed, cherubic toddler with a gummy smile. A tear traced a path down Clara's cheek, leaving a glistening trail against the faded paint. She'd done what she thought was best. She'd acted out of love, out of a fierce protective instinct. But was it enough? Had she shielded her daughter from pain, or simply delayed it, making it even more agonizing? The apartment, once a haven, now felt like a prison, the walls closing in on her. The past 18 years replayed in her mind, a relentless loop of choices made and sacrifices endured. She'd lived a life defined by silence and secrecy, and now, the silence was breaking, the secrets spilling out. The truth was a tidal wave, threatening to engulf her, to sweep away the fragile life she'd so carefully built. She thought of Mike, the man she'd once loved with a fierce, reckless abandon. The man who was now suddenly, unexpectedly, a part of Sarah's life. She wondered what he thought, what he felt. Did he regret his absence? Did he bear the weight of his silence? Or would he merely see her as an obstacle, a complication in his perfect, carefully constructed life? A wave of nausea washed over her, the bitter taste of regret coating her tongue. She was about to face a confrontation she hadn't anticipated, a reckoning with a past she had desperately tried to bury. She had kept her secret for 18 years, sacrificing everything for her daughter's perceived well-being. But now the secret was out, and she had no idea how to navigate the emotional maelstrom that awaited her. The path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, a minefield of potential hurt and heartbreak. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across her small, cluttered apartment, she felt a profound sense of dread and utter helplessness. The weight of her choices, the consequences of her actions, bore down on her, suffocating her in a tide of guilt and overwhelming sorrow. The truth had been revealed, and the aftermath would be far more difficult to bear than she could have ever imagined.